All right. So now, unless you have some issues with your video, which you should, again, send me a chat message. If you're still having issues with it, you should have your videos on at all classes, especially when we have quizzes and tests. I have to see you during the quiz and test. So if for some reason your camera doesn't work or having issues, you need to get that fixed because it's required, not just necessary, it's required by the university that if you're taking a course remotely, that you have a video, especially for tests, right? So it's something that you can't just let slide. You have to fix it, get a camera. Um, if your computer doesn't have a camera, buy one. Make sure you have one that's available. All right. So yeah. So if you can't get it fixed, get a new one. Get one that you can order. You can just. I have an additional camera on my computer. I have a camera on my computer, and then I have a one that I attach to my computer right now. So you definitely need to have a camera uh, for, for for this course, for all your courses, not just this one. If you're going to be taking a course remotely, otherwise we can't see you, can't see what you're doing. And I hope you understand, as a instructor, we have to in this type of course we have to see you. We have to see. So make sure that you have your videos on. All right now, I only see two people who send me a chat message about your videos not being able, your camera's not working, but there are several of you who still have um, videos off. So if you do have working videos, turn them on now, please. All right. So what's the schedule for this week? Today, I'm going to give you a review. And when I say review, I'm not talking about giving you the answers to questions, but I'm giving you sort of an idea, types of topics that will be covered. Test number one, which is this Thursday, should be the easiest of the three tests that you'll be taking. Just introductory material. It's all the material that we covered in the first 5 chapters, right? It is multiple choice, and there's 22 multiple choice questions, and 5 points each. That's 110 points, right? Now I count the tests as if they're 100 points. So it means I'm giving you extra credit on each of the tests. All right. So I do that because when I first started teaching at Rowan, and it's true at other schools too, that I would always get people at the end of the semester who would ask for extra credit. All right. I don't like giving extra credit at the end of the semester because typically it's people who have not done the work who ask for extra credit. So I typically don't like doing that, and I don't know any professor who does, to be honest with you, whether they do it or not. So it's to get around that, I make all the tests 110 points, and I count them as if they're 100 points. And you'll see it when I actually grade on Canvas your tests, because I have to make an adjustment to your scores so that the Canvas actually calculates your overall grade correctly, right? It calculates it as a percentage, so I have to make some adjustments. So just know that's there. I'm giving you that extra credit. And I'm also, of course, if you look at the grading scheme, passing grades and so forth are lower than other courses. Typically, other math courses, 60 is out of 100 is a pass. And in this course, it's lower than 60 out of, potentially 110. So please understand that, so that at the end of the semester, if you ask for extra credit and I say no, you'll understand why, because I've already given you extra credit. So just know that. And if you, and here's the key to the scores. If you follow along and do everything that I ask you to do, you should do fine. You should do fine. And I noticed that people tend to do very well in the first quiz, which is actually a good sign. Typically, people don't do as well in the first quiz because they're not used to my quizzes. But it was a good sign that many people did well. So I'm assuming everybody will do well today too, because I'm giving quiz number 2 today, but it's only on chapter 5. So it'll be easier to actually look things up in your book because it's only one chapter. I'll try to give a quiz every week except for the week after a test. The week after a test, I typically wait one more week to give you the next quiz. So the way the schedule is, if you look at the schedule, you see there are right now 9 quizzes that are scheduled and 3 tests. All right, and then of course you have your final exam. Attendance obviously is part of your grade too, so I do look at your attendance, and it's 10% of your grade. So if you get perfect attendance or something close to it, then you probably get that full 10 points. If you don't attend class very often, obviously you're not going to get a high score on your attendance. So that's an easy 10% right there. All right. Any questions about grading or anything else like that? And as I said, this first test is the easiest of the 3 tests, but doesn't mean you shouldn't study for it. You should absolutely, in my judgment, you should be reading all the chapters. And then as far as studying, obviously the PowerPoints are there, but the PowerPoints are not going to cover everything that's in the book. So if I were you, I would read and reread, read it again before you take your test. You can look over the videos that I record. And if you prepare like that, the first test should be okay. You should do fine in it. Again, multiple choice, there's going to be 4 possible answers for each of the multiple choice questions. Any questions about the, in general, what the grading scheme is supposed to be like? Anything? All right. So let's see. Okay, good. Some of you responded about your videos. Good. All right. So again, it's very, very important. I'm telling you up front, with the final exam, I have to see you in the final exam. That's a requirement in this course. All right. So if you don't have a video with a camera that works, you have to get one before the final exam for sure. All right. But ultimately, if for some reason you don't have one for the first test, I'll let it. It'll be all right. But test number 2 and test number 3 will not be all right. So please get the camera, either get it fixed or get a new one that you can attach to your computer. The final exam, it's required. You have to be having. We have to see you. It's required. So there's nothing I can do about that part of it. Yeah. All right. So some of you are still responding about your webcam and everything. Okay, that's fine. Again, you're telling me, and that's great. But just know, again, for test 2 and test 3, it has to be all ready to go, and for the final exam too. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the test. So the test covers all 5 chapters, and again, there's not much here in terms of calculations or anything like that. This is pretty much a concept first test. Yes, and somebody asked, is it open book? Yes, all your tests are open book. This is the other thing. That's it makes it easy for you. In one sense, it makes it easy, and on the other sense, open book is dangerous, right? Dangerous meaning that you may come in overconfident, thinking I don't need to study. I can just look things up. There's not enough time in your test to do that. I'll give you 70 minutes to complete the test. So the test will start at 8:05 and go to 9:15. So that's 70 minutes. That's all you have. So for 22 multiple choice questions. So if you're just going to be sitting the whole time looking things up, that's not a great strategy. You need to know stuff coming in and just know where things are so you can double check. But to just walk in cold and expect that you can look everything up, there's just not enough time. You're not going to finish the test in time. So that's the danger part of open book. But on the other hand, it's a good thing to have, because then you know that you don't have to stress yourself about memorizing things. You can sort of know things, and if you're not sure, you can look them up. But to go in cold and not know anything and then think that you can pass this test, no, that's not the way to do it, and it's a very dangerous way of doing it, and your chances of passing are going to be much lower. All right, and I want all of you to get A's. I mean, if all of you got A's in my tests, perfectly happy. I don't grade anything on a curve where a certain percentage get A's, certain percentage get B's. No, you all get A's, you all get A's. So um, my goal is that that's my goal, is you all do very well in the course. There's no one that does not do well. All right, so chapter 1 is about the benefits and risks of using statistics. It's just a general introduction to why we use statistics. Um, there's a sort of a basic definition about what statistics is. It looks for patterns and relationships. And it talks about doing statistical studies. This is on page 7. So this was actually on your first quiz. It talked about making sure that you have a representative sample. Now, when we say representative sample, it does not mean that the sample looks exactly like the population, and actually probably won't. But what we want to do is do random samples. Okay, that's one of the big takeaways from the first 5 chapters, is we want to do a random sample. That is a representative sample. And the reason why we want to do a random sample is that we can quantify the risk or probability that the sample is not representative. We can actually quantify that. We haven't talked about that yet, but that's something that we can do. So a representative sample is that. We don't try to look at the population, try to figure out, how many people have this characteristic and how many people have that characteristic. No, we don't do that. What we do is we do a random sample. We pick people randomly from the population, and then we hope, if the sample size, the number of people in the sample, is large enough, that it will somewhat represent the population. And again, we can quantify how close that sample looks to the population. So that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that we do random sampling. Number 2, get a large enough sample. All right, sample has to be large enough. Now, there are statistical formulas for doing that. We're not going to learn that in this course. If you were taking my Stat 1 course, you would learn how to do that. It's not that hard to do, but we just have to know that we have to get a large enough sample. But the sample doesn't have to be huge. It could be small, relatively small, less. To be honest with you, it can be less than 10% of the size of the population for it to be okay. Right? It just has to be large enough. Number 3, we have to decide what type of study we're going to do, whether observational or a randomized experiment. So those are the 2 basic types of studies that we talked about in the first 5 chapters, observational versus randomized experiment. So you obviously have to know the definitions of those 2, right? Observational study is where we are observing, right? We're observing people or things. We're not actually controlling anything. And the randomized experiment is we are controlling what we call explanatory variables. And we want to see if there's a cause and effect relationship to a response variable. So there is a different focus on those 2 types of studies. Observational, more done to observe because maybe we can't do an experiment. And the randomized experiment is one where we can talk about cause and effect. All right. In this chapter 1, they also talk about the definition of a population and a sample. By the way, that is important for this first test. Now, the questions on the test aren't something like such and such is an example of a, and then blank, and then one of the answers is population. No, it's not like that. You'll have little mini scenarios, types of things, and then a question's asked about, all right, here's this situation. What is the population? What is the sample? right? That sort of thing. Um, that's that's basically the type of thing it is. So it's not, these very easy, direct questions where you can just simply look it up and get the answer. You have to think about what you're looking at and do a little bit of an analysis. There's not much of an analysis in these questions, but a little bit of an interpretation so you can choose the right answer, right? So that's what the questions are going to be more like, little scenarios. But population is that group of people or things from which we sample and from which we want to study some characteristic, height, weight, whatever it might be, or they may be answering a question on a survey. But the population is that group, an overall group that we're interested in studying. It could be all students at Rowan University. It could be people in a city. It could be fish in a pond, whatever. The problem, whatever problem scenario I give you would describe the population. It'll describe it. The sample is just that, a subset of the population from which we are sampling, all right, from which we are choosing randomly people to be in our study. So, we have a large population, and assuming we have 1,000 people in our study, well, those 1,000 people is the sample, right? They're the sample, and we can call them actually units. Actually, the people who are in our study can be described as units. If it's a observational study, they would be called observational units or participants. That's another name for them. Or if it's an experimental study, they could be called experimental units, like that. All right. So whatever thing or person that we're doing the research on, or doing the measurements on, or asking the questions to, they are the units. So the word unit is actually something you need to remember. That's referring to that which we are asking the question to, or that in which we are doing a measurement. All right. All right. So sample, population, units, those are the types of definitions that are important. Um, there's things in here in the first chapter about the improper use of statistics, but I think that's pretty self-explanatory, how people misuse statistics. You can read through that just to get an idea. But the first chapter is pretty much an introduction, and there's not a whole lot in here in terms of being able to ask questions. But as I said already, there are a couple questions that are from chapter 1. So just read through it, make sure that you understand what they're talking about in chapter 1. And again, not many definitions, so not many things to tag in the chapter. Now, chapter 2 is basically about reading the news and looking for certain things. And when the news talks about different studies and so forth, they talk about 7 different types of things that you look for. They call them components. I would read through this just so you're familiar with these components. The 7 components, let me read through what they are. Again, these are recommendations for people when they see a news article, things that they should check on when they hear the reports about the study. And this is on page 20 and 21, so something you may want to tag. The component 1 is the source of the research and of the funding. So it's important to know, as a consumer of research, who did this research and who paid for it. That's component number 1. Component 2 is did the researchers have direct contact, or excuse me, we need to know if researchers had contact with the participants and who they were. Number 3, you want to know the individuals or objects studied and how they were selected. All right, now, individuals or objects studied, they're the units, all right, and how they were selected. So were they selected for the study using random sampling, right? Because remember, random sampling is the way you get participants for your study. So were the people randomly selected or were they volunteers? And this is important. If they are randomly selected properly, then you can generalize the results to the population. If it's non-random sampling, like a volunteer, people volunteering to be in your study, then you cannot necessarily generalize the results to the population because the results could be biased. Biased meaning they could be slanted in a certain direction, right? Because maybe the people who, maybe these are survey questions you're asking people, and maybe the people who participate have different opinions than those people who don't participate. So the answers could be biased and they may not represent the entire population. All right. So that's an important component. It's component number 2. And also component number 3, the individuals or objects studied and how they were selected. Number 4, the exact nature of the measurements made or questions asked. There's a whole part here in this chapter about measurements and the fact that measurements could be biased, all right, or they could be incorrect. So that's the type of thing that I'll go into in a couple minutes, just some things about measurements. Questions could be also biased, the way they're worded. The order of the questions could influence the way a participant answers the question. The wording of the question, right, could influence the answer. So there could be some bias there. And the whole idea of giving a questionnaire is that you get unbiased answers. So the idea of bias is also discussed in the first 5 chapters here. So that's something I want to go over with you also. Component 5 is the setting in which the measurements were taken. Is it a natural setting or is it an artificial lab experiment? Okay, that's important. Number 6, differences in the groups being compared in addition to the factor of interest. In other words, whatever we're studying is important, but also if we have groups of people that we're comparing, we want to notice the differences in the groups. And number 7, the size of any effects that we end up getting. Now, one thing that you do not see in any of these components is what? You don't see anything about the results of the experiment being controlled by the researcher, right? So the researcher, what do they control? They control the funding, they control the type of research you're doing, they control how they select participants, they control the questions that are given or the measurements that are taken. The one thing that the researchers do not control is the results of the experiment. If they did try to do that, then that's unethical, right? They're trying to, they fudge the results. That's considered very, very bad thing to do. So make sure that you understand that there's certain things that researchers can control, which is most of these components here that they're referring to, but they cannot control the results of the experiment. That's what beyond the control of the researcher. I'm bringing that to your attention because there could be a question on your test related to that idea. All right. So then they have some examples of these 7 components in the rest of this chapter. And I'm not going to go through these with you. Read through them as examples of each of them, just so that you're familiar with what they mean. They have a couple case studies and so forth about this. So that's chapter 2. All right. Chapter 2 is basically introducing the components of things that a consumer like yourself could look at when reading about a research study. And then that important idea that the researcher has control over many things during the study, but they do not have control over the results of the study. Chapter 3 deals with some of the ideas of measurement and bias in studies. So this is an important chapter here for this test in terms of definitions and what they mean. All right, so pay attention to chapter 3 because there's several questions on the test on this chapter. And basically, it's the idea of bias means that the study is not giving a true accounts of the population, it's being slanted in a certain direction. And so we have to know what these biases are when, as not only a consumer of research, but the researchers themselves have to know what the biases are. Now, there are several of them that are mentioned here, so you have to know what they mean. The first one is called deliberate bias. And this is, I think, hopefully an easy one to remember because it means that the researcher is deliberately misleading you in a certain direction, right? Let's say you have a questionnaire and they want they want you to answer in a certain way, so they word the question in a certain way so that you will tend to answer it in that way, right? So that is called deliberate bias. The research is deliberately trying to get you to answer the question in a certain direction, all right? And again, this is on page 43. Read through the example that they show you in the book, and I think it's pretty clear what they mean by deliberate bias. There's also something called unintentional bias, where a question could be worded in a way that it could mean one thing and it could mean another thing. It's not that the researcher is trying to sway you in a particular direction. It could just be that the wording isn't quite clear. And so the person could be swayed in a certain direction unintentionally. So that's called unintentional bias. Again, look through that. It's just a short little description on page 43. Also on page 43 is this idea that many people who participate in research studies and if they are being interviewed in person or even over the phone, there's a desire to please the researcher, right? The respondent wants to please the researcher. This is just a human nature. And so the respondent may give an answer that's not really the right answer, not really the true answer, because they're trying to please the researcher. And again, they give an example in here of how that can happen. But certainly, if if a policeman comes to your door and asks, have you taken any recreational, and one of the questions they're asking, part of the study is, have you taken recreational drugs within the last year? And let's say you have, but there's a policeman standing in front of you. You want to please that policeman. You don't want to get that policeman angry and possibly arresting you. So you will say, no, I have not taken recreational drugs, when the answer should have been yes. So that has to do with the desire to please. All right, you're trying to give the answer that you think the researcher wants to know. All right. There's on page 44. There's a type of bias called asking the uninformed. That's the example where researchers just make something up and somebody will just believe it because they think, why am I being asked this question if it's not really true? And you give an opinion about something that's not really, doesn't really exist. And they give examples of this in your book. Another type of bias is unnecessary complexity, which means that researchers trying to be too fancy with their wording tend to be confusing to the participants. The wording is confusing, and therefore it's hard to understand what the researcher is asking. So unnecessary complexity sometimes can lead to wrong answers that are not the answers that you would ordinarily give. Ordering of questions is another type of bias, where if questions are ordered in one way and then they're ordered in another way, you get different responses because of the information that you're getting from a previous question. So they give an example of that too. They also talk about confidentiality versus anonymity. People tend to be more honest about their answers if they know it's confidential or anonymous than if they were giving their name. So that's something that's part of this chapter here. All right. Then the idea of open and closed questions. You should know exactly what they mean. A closed question means there are answers that are chosen for them. All right. So they ask a question and then they have maybe 4 or 5 choices, and you choose one of those 5 choices. That's called a closed question. An open question means that the participant is free to answer in any way they want. All right. So closed question is like your test that you're going to be taking on Thursday, where I give you answer choices and you choose the best one. That's a closed question. An open question would be an essay question, right? I give you a question and then you write freely your answer. That's an open question. So I hope you know from your own experience now what the difference between those two are. There is a chance that there is a question on your test that deals with the difference between open and closed questions, all right? And they talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both types of them in this chapter. Then they talk about measurement. They make it clear that measuring things like concepts and attitudes is harder to do. It's more prone to error than if we were measuring height or weight. And I think that's pretty obvious, right? Because how do we measure happiness? We just ask like 4 or 5 questions and that tells us if the person's happy or not. Well, that's, debatable. Height and weight, well, we know how we measure height and weight, right? Is there standard ways of measuring height and weight? We also talk about in this chapter, let's second here. We also are defining, and this is something you should know, defining the types of variables. Now, this is in chapter 3, section 5, 3.5. I would tag this section to be very important, not just for this test, but for the final exam. All right? I'm telling you, this is an important section for both. So 3.5, make sure you put attention on it for this test and also for your final exam, which means you need to make a note about this now so that when you get to study for your final exam later, you know that this is an important section. Important sections because they define the types of variables that people study in their studies. They talk about categorical versus measurement variables. Categorical are those variables that are labels. They're categories. Categorical variable could be something like the types of cars that are on a used car lot, Buicks and Toyotas and Hyundais and all sorts of cars. Those are labels, they're categories. There's 2 types of categorical variables, ordinal and nominal. Ordinal means that there's a natural ordering to the categories. For example, if I was ranking people from 1st through 10 in terms of how well they do in the course, the rankings are ordered. All right, they're categorical and they're ordered. Variables that don't have a natural ordering, like the make of a car, those are called nominal. So make sure that you understand the difference between those two. For measurement variables, they talk about interval and ratio. Now, measurement variables are the quantitative variables. So the measurements, they're the things that we do math with. All right. There's 2 general types, continuous and discrete. Continuous measurement variables means that we can have any value for the measurement between 2 values on the number line. And discrete means we only have a few values that we can actually put dots on a number line. Typically counting things, that would be a discrete variable, quantitative variable. If we're measuring something like height or weight, that's continuous. They also mention for measurement variables, another breakdown of interval versus ratio variables. The difference between those two is that a ratio variable has a 0 value that means something, a meaningful 0. For example, money. If you have 0 money in your pocket, that literally means you're broke. So money is a ratio variable. Interval variable, 0 is not meaningful. For example, temperature. If it's 0 degrees outside, 0 degrees Fahrenheit, it doesn't mean there's no heat. All right? It doesn't mean there's no heat. It just means it's just a scale, and 0 means whatever. It means it's cold, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's no heat. All right, so read through that. And then another thing that you should definitely know is the difference on page 54, tag this also, the difference between validity and reliability of a measurement. Validity, a valid measurement means that we're actually measuring something that with a measurement tool that actually does measure it. So in other words, we're not going to use a scale to measure height. That makes no sense, right? We don't use a scale to measure IQ. So that it has to be a valid measure. It has to be something that we're using to, and it does measure. And then reliable measure means something that even if it's a valid measure, it may not be reliable because it may give a different answer each time we use it. For example, if we use a ruler to measure the length, I think this is an example we gave in class. If we use a ruler to measure, you know, the length of a football field, that wouldn't be that's a valid measure because it's measuring the length, but it would be unreliable because first of all, it would be prone to error each time, so it wouldn't be very reliable. All right, and then they talk about bias measurements in here, the idea of bias, and read through that as far as the definition. Know about variability across our measurements. There's such a thing called natural variability, and also remember the following: the more variable, if we have two groups of people in a study, the more variable each of those groups are within themselves, it takes more people to be in the study so that we can know the difference or observe the difference between the two groups. All right, so the more variable the groups are, the more people we need in the study so that we can tell the difference between the two groups in whatever we're measuring. That's important to remember that. Then chapter 4, we only have a few more minutes, so let's get to chapter 4. They talk about the common research sampling studies, and also they look at the experiments too. On page 65, they talk about what a sample survey is, and they talk about what a randomized experiment is. They have definitions for explanatory variable, response variable. On page 64, they talk about observational studies. They mention something called a case control study. Meta-analysis is mentioned, things like that, just the basic definitions. And then the important thing comes in the sampling part of the chapter 4 here, where they talk about simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster sampling, systematic sampling. Telling you right now, you need to know the differences between all of these types of sampling. I'm going to ask you to tag this section here, section 4.4. They have the definition for simple random sampling. They have an example in there. They have stratified sampling, an example, and cluster sample, an example, systematic sampling with an example. Read and discuss from pages 71 through 75. Read that carefully. Make sure you understand the differences between them. Don't go into the test thinking, I'm just going to look them up when if there's a question about it. Bad, 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 I have to tell you, idea. Do not do that. You should be familiar with these. Now, you may get them confused, but at least you're familiar with them enough so that when you look them up, they say, oh, yeah, I know the difference now. Right? But don't try to learn it during the test. Okay? It's a really bad idea. You're not going to understand it first time through. So please read through it, look at the examples, make sure that you understand the differences between those types of sampling. That is on your test, that's on your final exam also. I'm telling you, it's on both. So this is another part of the course that you need to tag for both this test number 1 and the final. All right. So please read through this. Also on page 68, there are definitions, unit, population, sampling. Make sure you understand what a sampling frame is. That's the list from which the sample is chosen from. All right. Sometimes we don't have a list of the population, so we use the sampling frame as the list of units that we choose the population from. know what a census is. All of that is on page 68. Tag that also. I'm telling you exactly where you need to tag to understand this sort of thing. Also, make sure you understand what a volunteer sampling is, or convenience sampling. They talk about that later in this chapter. I know those are non-probability samples. They are not random samples, all right? And when they're not random samples, you cannot generalize it to the population. And chapter 5 is the last chapter, the one we're doing the quiz on today. And this has to do with experiments mostly, but also the difference between experiments and observational studies. Again, they describe explanatory variable, response variable, treatments. All right, make sure you understand it. Understand, this is really important. Understand that randomization of treatments to, in an experiment, of treatments to participants is not the same thing as random sampling. Random sampling has to do with bringing participants into the study. Randomization has to do with people who are already in the study randomly assigning the treatments to the people who are already in the study. So randomization deals with people in the study, in the experimental study. They've already been chosen, they're in the study, and you're randomly assigning treatments to them. That's randomization, right? Please understand the difference between those two. All right. They also talk about interacting variables in here. Understand what interacting means. It means that two explanatory variables are interacting with one another, producing different results in the response variable, depending on how they're interacting. So that's something that you want to look at least understand the basic principle of it. They talk about the different types of units, experimental units versus observational units. So in an experiment, we talk about experimental units. In an observational study, we talk observational units. And then they talk about, besides randomization, they talk about placebos, control groups, blinding, all of these things you need to go over. And also make sure that you understand that there's a couple different types of experimental designs. Match pairs and blocks and repeated measures. Please understand that in a very general way what they mean. And then one other thing I want to bring to your attention here is some effects that could occur during an experiment. They talk about the placebo effect. There's something called the Hawthorne effect and experimental effects. And also this thing called ecological validity, which has to do with the fact that if the experiment was done in a artificial setting, it may not apply to a natural setting. That's called there could be a lack of ecological validity to the study because you can't generalize it to a more natural setting. They talk about designing a good observational study in here. They talk about a little bit about case control studies, which is a type of observational study. It's not an experiment. And please note the difference between retrospective and prospective studies. That's on page 107. That's important to be on your test. And that's it. So that is, we have 2 more minutes. That is basically the topics. I've gone through it pretty quickly, but it's going to be on your recording here, so you'll be able to hear it again. Those are the types of topics that could be on your test. I also mentioned those topics that could very well be on your final exam also, which I will do throughout the course. Whenever I run into a topic that could show up on your final, I will mention it. Make sure you take notes about that. Don't forget about that because I'm doing it purposely so that you don't forget later, right? Any questions? Any questions about what I've talked about today? No questions? Okay. So quiz again. Today is going to be on chapter 5 alone, just chapter 5. And again, basically definitions and concepts basically in chapter 5. All right. And once again, for the test on Thursday, it will start at 8:05 promptly. All right. So, all right. Many of you will get it done early. I'll assure you that most of you will get tests done early. All right, so it's 8:50. Go ahead and check Canvas to see if the quiz is opened up. Give me a thumbs up. I have John Bolin, Aaliyah Brown, Nicole Colligan. You see, I see a thumbs up from Nicole. Great. All right. So it looks like, yep, I see other thumbs up. Fantastic. So I'm going to put myself on mute and please start the quiz. I will allow you to leave early today. So if you're done your quiz, just leave early. It's fine. And don't rush through the quiz. You do have 20 minutes to complete it. And all right. That's it.